Good evening. Tonight we're doing something a bit out of the ordinary. This is the full, sprawling story of morphine, the so-called miracle medicine that dulled the torment of the battlefield and eventually helped create what physicians would later call soldier's disease. Set aside that clean, heroic myth of steady medical progress. The history of morphine is woven from threads of relief and discovery, yes, but just as tightly from threads of profit, craving, and unexpected fallout. If you were lying on a crowded wartime ward with shattered limbs and nights that refused to end, chances are you'd have reached for exactly what those soldiers did. And that single decision could have altered everything that followed in your life. If you like this kind of deep dive, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I never get tired of seeing how far this community stretches. Dim the lights, clear your head. We're going to trace the path from poppy fields to battlefronts. People grasped the power of the poppy long before they had a precise name for it. They noticed the round seed pods, the resinous amber fluid that seeped from a careful cut, the strange heavy sweetness that took the sharp edge off hurt and mourning. In the sun-baked mud brick towns of Sumer and Akkad, 2,500 to 3,000 years before the Common Era, clay tablets listed plants and remedies in painstaking rows. Later generations of scholars would seize on a phrase often translated as the plant of joy. Hul-gil, they argued, was probably the faint ancient echo of opium. Archaeologists have unearthed poppy seeds and poppy imagery. On Crete, in Minoan frescoes whose colors still cling to plaster after millennia, stylized poppy heads appear like offerings on an altar. These are small, stubborn bits of proof that whoever first learned to draw comfort from Papaver somniferum did so again and again in different corners of the earth in homes and shrines and healers' rooms, repeating the discovery in 1,000 subtle variations. In Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, compiled around 1550 BCE but reflecting much older medical lore, lists mixtures and concoctions for pain, for cough, for sleeplessness. Among its lines sit preparations most historians now read as unmistakably opiate in nature. The opium that traveled down into the Nile Valley brought more than just symptom relief. It arrived with ceremonial uses and a hint of the sacred, taking up a place in the pharmacopoeia that was part remedy and part spoken charm. India named the substance, catalogued it, and taught it a role inside the measured patient grammar of Ayurveda. Sanskrit writings speak of ahifena. Sushruta and other later compilers of medical doctrine described poppy-based treatments for diarrhea, for persistent cough, for pain, and as sleep-promoting aids in the larger craft of reducing suffering. China as well kept opium in its medical armamentarium for many centuries, using it as a treatment to sew shut the open seams of anxiety and soothe upheaval in the gut. Long before bowls and pipes of smoke turned the poppy into the social and geopolitical catastrophe that filled 18th and 19th century newspapers, the Greco Roman world used it in a more sober way, without sentimentalizing it. Physicians in the Hippocratic tradition employed poppy-derived preparations. Theophrastus and Dioscorides wrote detailed descriptions of the plant and its milky latex, noting its sleep-bringing and pain-dulling effects. Dioscorides, whose De Materia Medica would sit on apothecaries' tables for hundreds of years, recorded recipes, doses, and warnings with pragmatic care. Galen then layered on the logic of humors, weighing opium's drying and cooling tendencies as a doctor who had come to see the body as a delicate equilibrium. When Roman traders sailed eastward, they carried not only cloth, spice, and silk, but amphorae and sealed packets of poppy latex. The trading web of the Mediterranean and beyond could be tasted in a physician's shop in Antioch or a tavern in distant Gaul. Behind all these uses sat a pile of simple but repeatable craft techniques. A pre-modern apothecary did not think in terms of molecules, but in terms of feel and temperature, of macerations and infusions, of decoctions and tinctures. To make laudanum, the name that eventually settled on alcohol-based opium tincture. A practitioner would soak crude opium in wine or spirit, often with spices, then strain and bottle it as a bedside staple. To calm a sailor's churning stomach or to hush a fevered child at midnight, the apothecary would weigh powders, soak, press, filter, and hand over a dose counted in drops or in grains. The fact that no one could fully control or even describe the exact composition was accepted. There was simply no better option. Across the Mediterranean, healers learned to boil and condense plant juices, to clarify them, to blunt their force with wine or honey. A formula penned in a monastery garden might be echoed centuries later by an herbalist in Baghdad or a surgeon in Toledo. What shifted most was not the plant itself, but the confidence with which it was prescribed and the webs of correspondence and trade that carried that confidence from place to place. Translation centers in the Islamic world, copying rooms in European monasteries, and the increasingly systematic apothecaries of the Renaissance all helped set the stage. In dusty scriptoria and smoke-darkened workshops, the groundwork of pharmacology was being laid down piecemeal. Technical knowledge mattered: how to score a seed capsule, how to dry the latex into a dark wax-like lump that could be ground, how to dissolve, then redissolve, how to measure with crude cups and handheld scales, later with more precise balances and units like grains and fractions of a grain. Traders learned how to package poppy products for long journeys. Opium pressed into cakes, wrapped in resinous cloth, sealed in clay jars, and moved them across frontiers. From the fields of Anatolia and Crete to the quays of Alexandria and Antioch. From the markets along the Indus to the chilly inlets where Venetian galleys took on silks, spices, and occasionally carefully wrapped parcels of opium itself. Overland caravan routes bound distant communities like beads on a string. Sea lanes across the Mediterranean braided those threads together. In the early modern Ottoman state, officials licensed and taxed cultivation in certain provinces, pulling the poppy into the spreadsheets and ledgers of bureaucracy. Trade routes transmitted more than cargo. They carried methods. A formula tried in Alexandria might be copied by an apothecary in Leon. An extraction technique developed in China could be imitated in a Genoese shop. The material culture of opium-its containers, knives, spatulas traveled along with the drug. So did the larger notion that the powers of a plant could be concentrated, exported, and treated as a commodity. Medieval and early modern Europe took in this inheritance and reshaped it. Muslim physicians such as Rhazes and Avicenna wrote about opium with a clear, experience-driven tone. Avicenna's canon of medicine, finished in the early 11th century, became a standard medical reference for centuries in the Islamic world and through Latin translations across Western Europe. When Arabic medical texts were rendered into Latin in Toledo and Sicily in the 12th and 13th centuries, their pharmacology flowed northward into Paris and Bologna, seeding teaching in medieval universities and informing the apothecaries who clustered around those schools. The printing press accelerated the spread of recipes. In the 16th century, Paracelsus, impatient with armchair scholasticism, demanded that doctors pay attention to the workshop and the tincture bottle rather than to books alone. He framed remedies in more chemical terms, an attitude that would echo in the minds of later chemists who thought of potency as something that could be tuned and measured. In the 17th century, the English physician Thomas Sydenham, sometimes called the English Hippocrates, championed laudanum as a broadly useful drug. His followers and successors used opium for an ever wider range of complaints. In that era, laudanum was a near universal fallback in a world that had neither antibiotics nor modern anesthesia, a small, strong, portable, and intoxicating answer for cough, fever, and insomnia. The glass bottles that went home with sailors, patients, and soldiers contained a concentrated fragment of a tradition stretching back to the gardens and temple courtyards of the ancient Near East. That gradual build-up of practice formulas, tinctures, compendia mattered, because it kept opium in active, everyday medical use, and because it created the conceptual scaffolding for a later mental leap. The apothecary's long training, the university lecture on materia medica, the recipe books that circulated from hand to hand, these were the invisible supports for the idea that within a plant there might be one specific active principle that could be isolated. To pull a single consistent compound out of a messy herbal mixture required apparatus and patience, but it also depended on a mental shift, the suspicion that there was such a single, repeatable agent, responsible for what earlier generations had simply described as the overall action of a drug. That intuition lived in the minds of early chemists at the turn of the 19th century. nourished by the chemical revolution that had redefined how people spoke about substances and reactions. The chapter of morphine's isolation starts not in a roaring industrial lab, but in a modest German town. Friedrich Wilhelm Adam Sertürner wasn't a royal court chemist or a university chair. He was an apprentice apothecary, a careful, persistent young man in Paderborn. Around 1803, he began chasing an idea that had become the new hope of natural philosophers, that hidden amid nature's confusing mixtures were a few pure, crystalline substances that could be separated and examined on their own. He handled opium much as generations before him had handled it as tincture and powder. But his temperament and ambition were different. Where earlier practitioners had accepted the tincture as good enough, Sertürner wanted a stable, countable substance, something that could be weighed, accurately dosed, and, most importantly, reproduced. He succeeded in a way that startled his peers. Using the chemical tricks available at the time, acid-base manipulations, successive crystallizations and washings, careful watching and recording, he obtained a white, bitter crystal. When this substance was given to humans or animals, it reproduced the hallmark effects of opium: sleep, pain relief, and a distinct kind of euphoria. Sertürner called it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, because sleep seemed to be its defining action. Naming it was an intellectual claim in itself. Where many still treated opium as one unified remedy, he asserted that there was a single chemical principle at its core. He published his observations with measured detail rather than bombast, reporting experiments and, in the risky spirit of the age, his own self-experimentation. He weighed, he recorded, he argued that this pure substance could deliver opium's power without the variability and bulk of crude latex. Sertürner's work landed at a moment when the scientific world was ready to interpret it. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, chemistry had grown from the hobby of curious gentlemen into a structured analytic discipline. Antoine Lavoisier had rewritten chemical nomenclature and banished the old phlogiston theory. Quietly rigorous labs in Paris, Gießen, and Göttingen were training a new generation to think about elements, compounds, and reactions as puzzles to be solved through experiment and calculation. A young German chemist reading translated papers from Paris or London could see that what Sertürner had done was a big deal. It suggested a way to strip away the unpredictability of plant remedies and turn them into precise clinical tools. The first reaction to Sertürner's morphium was a blend of curiosity and doubt. That an obscure apothecary's assistant could pull out a pure substance from opium and christen it with a name struck some as overstepping in a culture where salons and academies still policed intellectual authority. But other chemists repeated his procedures, sometimes with better apparatus, sometimes almost by accident. And over the following decades, the hunt for active principles in plants became a standard project. One after another, chemists isolated quinine from cinchona bark, strychnine, caffeine, codeine. Alkaloid chemistry exploded. Alkaloids came to describe this whole class of nitrogen containing basic compounds responsible for many of nature's most powerful pharmacological effects. Each newly isolated alkaloid reinforced Sertürner's method and nudged medical confidence away from the old vague tinctures toward exact compounds with definable doses and predictable effects. As the substance moved into English and other languages, morphium became morphine. The softer Latinized ending sharpened into a more clinical-sounding one. Morphine's crystalline nature made the whole idea concrete. A physician could now talk about 1 milligram of morphine the way a banker might talk about a pound of coin, something countable and specific. That precision felt modern, even though the practical methods of producing those crystals were still more craft than industry. A series of careful separations, guided by taste, smell, sight, and experience skills developed by apothecaries over years, were at the heart of early morphine work. The techniques Sertürner had used, creating salts, dissolving and recrystallizing, washing for purity, became the model for future natural product chemistry. It was, in a sense, one of the first real breaks between pharmacology and folk remedy. The laser focus on isolating an active principle ushered in an era in which substances drawn from plants would be measured, standardized, and turned into commodities. If Sertürner opened the door, 19th-century chemistry widened the hallway. Crystallization was no longer just a sign of purity, it became a hint of industrial promise. Crystals could be measured, labeled, packed, and shipped. By the 1820s and 1830s, German chemical firms like E. Merck in Darmstadt recognized alkaloids as a new commercial frontier. Heinrich Emanuel Merck and his contemporaries saw that a stable substance, reproducibly manufactured, could be shipped in labeled vials to doctors across Europe and out to distant ports and colonies. Laboratories moved from a single bench to small factory floors. University chemistry departments trained not just scholars, but technicians to work in these growing enterprises. Pedagogues like Justus von Liebig in Gießen helped turn laboratory instruction into a formal discipline, so that young workers could be taught exactly how to produce reliable alkaloids at scale. This wasn't yet 20th century mass production, but it was a clear departure from the unpredictable world of homemade tinctures towards standardized pharmaceutical goods. Two particular technical developments mattered. First, chemists learned to characterize compounds beyond taste and crystal shape by measuring melting points, solubility in different solvents, and acid-base reactions. Published in journals and in pharmacopoeias, these data helped chemists and pharmacists speak a shared language across borders. It was a de facto standardization before strict legal codes caught up. Second, 19th century chemists discovered that many biologically active plant compounds worked better and were easier to use if they were converted into salts. Combining an alkaloid with an acid produced salts that dissolved in water, which meant they could be injected, dripped, or swallowed as aqueous solutions. Morphine lent itself to this approach. Morphine sulfate, morphine hydrochloride, and other salts could be crystallized and readily dissolved in water. The practical impact was enormous. A water-soluble morphine salt could be made into an injectable solution, poured into small vials, shipped with written directions, and dosed more accurately than an irregular chunk of raw opium rolled into a pill. These salt forms weren't just laboratory curiosities, they were a pivot on which medicine swung into a new era. The invention of the hypodermic syringe finished that transformation in a way no single chemist could have predicted. In 1853, a French surgeon named Charles Pravaz and, independently that same year, a Scottish physician named Alexander Wood devised instruments for injecting liquids beneath the skin. Tell the story gently, and it's about artisans perfecting tools to deliver drugs straight into tissue and blood, rather than relying on the slow, unpredictable process of digestion. The syringe turned morphine from something swallowed or rubbed on into a fast-acting, high-impact agent of immediate comfort. A battlefield surgeon could finally turn down pain in minutes. A laboring woman could be given a measured dose. A hospital patient in London could be guided into sleep before the hour was out. Picture it, a tiny bottle, crystalline powder just dissolved into a clear solution, a syringe flashing briefly under candlelight or the pale glow of gas lamps on a ward, a needle slipping into the hollow of an arm. It must have felt like a kind of everyday magic practical sorcery that gave doctors a sense of new power, and for a while the aura of miracle workers. It also made morphine more efficient at its primary task, blunting pain and softening perception. And efficiency carries a price when you're dealing with substances that can carve grooves of habit and dependence. The 19th century, with its steam engines, factories, cheap printing, and rising literacy, opened fresh markets. Pharmacies in Paris and London began keeping bottles of morphine salts and pre-weighed powders on their shelves. Advertising crept in. Commercial catalogues stocked morphine right alongside strychnine, quinine, and other chemical specialties. The traditional compounding apothecary part herbalist, part chemist morphed into something like the first industrial-era pharmacist, buying raw opium and pre-isolated alkaloids from chemical houses and turning them into prescribed mixtures or selling them directly over the counter. Trade grew in volume. Crude opium still traveled in its old familiar forms, bricks and lumps shipped from India, Ottoman territories, and Mediterranean hinterlands. But increasingly, the sought-after end product was not unprocessed latex, but the purified alkaloid. European ports began receiving crates of crystalline morphine and its salts, labeled in German, French, and English. The British East India Company, which managed opium production and export from India for colonial profit, stayed at the center of the system. The bitter politics of opium and empire would explode into the Opium Wars with China in the mid-19th century, but alongside that noisy conflict, a quieter commercial stream was delivering both raw and refined opiates to Europe and the Americas. In the United States, apothecaries in cities like Boston and Philadelphia stocked laudanum and morphine. Young manufacturing centers in the Northeast wove these drugs into the fabric of healthcare and domestic life. They were easy to get, fully legal, and for many people, a simple, dependable comfort. Standardization crept into official drug lists. As more labs published analytical data, dosing units shifted from vague tincture terms, a drop, a drachm, to grains and eventually to milligrams as balances became more exact. National pharmacopeias, the official reference books for approved medicines and their specifications, began to include morphine salts with precise descriptions of appearance and strength. Medical language had been inching toward numeracy for a long time, but here was a crisp example where chemical analysis, industrial manufacturing, and clinical use all fit together. In theory, a physician could prescribe a particular number of grains of morphine sulfate, and a pharmacist could reliably deliver that amount. In that success lay a quiet irony. A time-honored herbal remedy soaked in the aura of antiquity had become a branded, bottled, factory-made product, an expression of the 19th century faith that technical skill and scale could solve almost any problem. The same forces that let a surgeon still a soldier's agony on a battlefield also made it easier for a short-term treatment to slide into long-term habit. War would make that point brutally clear. During the American Civil War, army surgeons used morphine on a vast scale for wounds, amputations, and fevers. Hypodermic syringes were available. Field tents were well supplied with opiates, and the need for pain relief after brutal days of combat was overwhelming. When troops came home, some brought scars and missing limbs, and some brought something less visible, a dependence neither they nor their doctors, however well-intentioned, yet recognized as a distinct public health issue. By the late 19th century, medical writers began using the phrase soldier's disease, a clumsy label for the pattern emerging. Men treated responsibly with morphine during the war who were left with a lasting compulsion after. By the middle and end of that century, morphine had traveled a strange arc. Humans had known its parent plant for thousands of years. A provincial German apothecary's patient work had turned the old poppy juice into a modern active principle. Then industrial chemistry turned that principle into a commodity that could be standardized, advertised, and injected. Pharmacies proliferated. Firms like Merck printed catalogs and labels. Official drug manuals laid down rules. Medicine gained tools that made pain manageable in ways ancestors would have considered almost supernatural. But success cast a shadow. Efficiency and repeatability hallmarks of technological progress also increased the drug's potential to forge exactly the dependence doctors had hoped to avoid. Morphine itself hadn't changed. Human systems, economic, medical, military, had magnified its reach. The 19th century closed with morphine settled comfortably into both clinic and parlor. Bottles of laudanum sat in drawing rooms. Chemists' cabinets bristled with small vials of morphine crystals. The jargon surrounding it grew precise. Its physical form, white, crystalline, bitter, became an icon of a new, more exact pharmacology. And yet the stories to come would have to wrestle with consequences that weren't purely medical, but deeply social. How a symbol of mercy could become a source of bondage in places as different as trenches, hospital wards, and the quiet bedrooms of veterans and patients with chronic pain that offered no straightforward escape. For the moment, in those cautious, meticulous years, the foundation had been set. Sticky plant sap had been turned into a defined compound, that compound into a marketed item, and that item into a routine tool of modern medicine. In the language of the era, it was a triumph of analytical chemistry. In everyday terms, it was a new kind of comfort one that would, with a kind of slow, implacable logic, teach the world difficult lessons about how much convenience can cost. In the dim, oil-lit consulting rooms of mid-Victorian practice, another quiet revolution began. As discreet as a bent needle, as exact as a sewing thread, the hypodermic syringe did not arrive with fanfare or official proclamation. It seeped into daily work the way a sapling splits pavement by constant, intimate pressure. The first documented instance of piercing the body with a hollow needle is usually traced half proudly, half sheepishly, to Francis Rind in Dublin in the 1840s. Faced with a patient in excruciating neuralgia, he cobbled together a crude device that could deliver a pain-relieving solution beneath the skin. It was not some glorious turning point, but an improvised, hands-on solution. A doctor confronted by a jaw or limb he couldn't comfort with words alone. So he made a small puncture and put the remedy where the protesting nerves lived. That core idea, simple, slightly brutal and brilliant, took the rest of the decade for skilled craftsmen in Paris and Edinburgh to refine into a reliable instrument. By 1853, Alexander Wood in Edinburgh and Charles Pravaz in Lyon, working independently and not exactly inclined to flatter each other, had turned the crude prototype into devices fit for an operating table. Wood practitioner, tinkerer, and meticulous explainer constructed a slim glass barrel and a hollow steel needle, with a plunger that moved as smoothly as a metronome. He presented it as a way to attack pain that seemed rooted just under the skin or in discrete tissues. He described localized relief, hurting spots calmed right where they hurt. Pravaz, a French surgeon, built a compact, screw-driven metal syringe that appealed to the practical sensibilities of hospital surgeons and anyone who liked the solid heft of steel in hand. His early use case was injecting sclerosing agents into varicose veins, not dulling battlefield agony, but the underlying logic of the device was identical. Between Rind's first needle, Wood's elegant glass syringe, and Pravaz's screw-plunger metal instrument, the recognizable hypodermic syringe was born and began its slow spread from makers' benches into clinics and wards. It's worth pausing to handle these tools in the imagination. The glass cylinder cold, clear, small enough to vanish into a closed hand. The plunger gliding almost frictionlessly. The needle a fine, silver bright point flaring for a second where lamplight hits it. The faint metallic scent, the small hiss of expelled air. There was an intense precision to that contact. The clinician could measure, place, and then watch a patient's face change in seconds. Pain could drain away almost visibly. The body's raw urgency receded. Doctors, in turn, felt a new, heady sense that they could reach inside and alter not just symptoms, but the very texture of sensation. Clinically, what the hypodermic accomplished is easy enough to describe and harder to fully reckon with. By bypassing the stomach and its slow variable chemistry, an injected dose of morphine began working more quickly and more completely than laudanum or ointments. The brain registered the change sooner, the nerves settled. For both surgeons and patients, that bordered on the miraculous. Someone nearly paralyzed by pain could be steadied enough to tolerate an amputation or to consent to a terrifying procedure. For people with chronic, recurring agony lives built around flare and lull, the syringe offered relief that was more consistent and more total than any prior remedy. Early case write-ups read almost like confessional literature. A patient with trigeminal neuralgia, screaming nightly, whose features softened after the second injection. An older woman bent double by rheumatic torment, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. A soldier, blood-soaked and half in shock, who, for a brief span after injection, could exist as more than just another casualty statistic. This revolution in delivery changed the nature of the drug almost as much as the drug changed medical practice. Morphine had been pulled from opium by Sertürner in the early 1800s and then turned into a commodity by chemists and pharmaceutical entrepreneurs across Europe. Once the needle offered a fast, reliable route in, that same molecule which had once crept into the system through the digestive tract now hit with a speed and intensity no one had fully anticipated. Doctors watched, with something like childlike glee, how quickly suffering ebbed when the gut was completely bypassed. They needed less drug to achieve the same effect. Some congratulated themselves on new precision. Others, more sober, noticed that the experience of relief itself felt different in kind. It wasn't only analgesia, it was a washing warmth, a brief, almost glowing euphoria that seemed to plant itself in a wounded man's memory and hang around long after the immediate crisis was over. Medical journals from the 1850s and 1860s are filled with debates, polite, footnoted skirmishes over what exactly the syringe was doing. Alexander Wood insisted that the key to injections lay in where you put them. He believed that sticking the needle into tissues near the offending nerve produced a sharply local effect. In London, Charles Hunter and others countered that morphine's main action was systemic. In their view, the needle was simply the most efficient way to get the drug into the general circulation. In practice, the fine point of the argument mattered less than the spread of the tool. Whether one thought the effect was local or whole body, morphine injected under the skin was faster and, in everyday experience, more reliable than earlier methods. Surgeons grew dependent on it. General practitioners discovered that a small injection was a discreet, effective method to soothe a terrified person before a minor operation or to comfort a woman in labor for whom chloroform alone was not enough. Hospitals stocked syringes. Pharmacists offered pre-mixed injectable morphine preparations. The device slipped naturally into daily routines, and those routines shifted to accommodate it. It would be neat to imagine that sterile technique and a matured understanding of risk arrived hand in hand with this potent innovation. They didn't. Joseph Lister's antiseptic protocols, which would reshape surgery in the latter half of the 19th century, were still years from broad adoption when hypodermics became commonplace. The same glass and steel that carried morphine could just as easily deliver bacteria. Abscesses and other complications followed some injections and were duly recorded in the literature with the same calm tone as the successes. Layered onto all this was an older moral vocabulary that struggled with the new chemistry. Many still believed that pain was meant to be borne, that suffering and endurance had spiritual meaning. The syringe rendered that view harder to justify. Pain began to look like a technical issue to be solved with skill and dosage. Moralists complained, pragmatic surgeons cheered. The earliest surgical case reports show the new arithmetic taking shape. In Edinburgh, Wood reported cases of trigeminal neuralgia and other nerve pains soothed by subcutaneous morphine. In Lyon, Pravaz's syringes appeared in vascular procedures and in the hands of obstetricians trying to control hemorrhage and spasmodic pain. In Paris hospitals, surgeons combined injected morphine with ether or chloroform, smoothing the rough edges of surgery and reducing how often they had to administer inhaled anesthetics. By the late 1850s, the hypodermic syringe had crossed fully into ordinary clinical and field practice, a portable comfort in a world still largely powered by muscles and steam. The change was technological, but its implications were social, a small tool that redefined who could be calmed, how quickly, and at what cost. If the hypodermic gave doctors new reach into the body, war supplied the large-scale test. The mid-19th century was ruthless in that regard. The Crimean War began in 1853, and within little more than a decade, the United States would be pulled into the grinding gears of its own civil war. Conflict gave the new tools their proving ground. The Crimean Campaign, famous now for logistical bungles and for the public outcry over soldiers' suffering sites, at a hinge point in this narrative. It unfolded almost simultaneously with the invention of the hypodermic. Surgeons there still relied mostly on traditional anesthetics and analgesics, laudanum, poultices, chloroform for operations, and improvised ambulance and hospital systems that were painfully inadequate. Florence Nightingale's crusades for cleaner hospitals and better nursing sprang out of that mess. Even so, in Crimea, the idea of direct, fast-acting pain relief had taken root. Accounts mention morphine in various forms and describe battlefield surgeons experimenting with primitive injections. The full, large-scale impact came with the American Civil War. Between 1861 and 1865, the US mobilized vast armies that fought large, sustained battles, leaving behind injuries that dwarfed the skirmishes of earlier wars. The volume of surgical work, especially amputations and treatment of complex gunshot fractures, was unlike anything the country had seen. Operating tables filled field tents. Surgeons routinely removed bullets, set smashed bones, and performed major operations under immense time pressure. To manage this, armies had to innovate in logistics as much as in technique. Jonathan Letterman, appointed medical director of the Army of the Potomac in 1862, designed an ambulance corps and phased triage system that for the first time in American warfare tried to reliably move the wounded off the battlefield and into organized care. That new structure mattered for morphine use. faster ambulance transport meant wounded men reached stabilization points sooner and received analgesia earlier. As they moved from field station to railhead to general hospital, their doses followed them, repeated at each stop. The Army Medical Department first, under Surgeon General Clement Finlay, then under William A. Hammond from 1862, had to supply that entire medical circulatory system. Procurement shifted from informal sutlers and ad hoc purchases to centrally organized contracts. Rivers and railroads became the arteries of not only men and ammunition, but also of medicines. Morphine in several preparations was boxed, bottled, and made standard issue for surgeons' kits. Specific hospitals, Armory Square in Washington, for instance, which received thousands of badly wounded men from the Eastern Theater, or temporary facilities clustered around major rail depots, show up in the records less as scenes of drama than as nodes, points where supplies arrived and where practices were repeated often enough to produce patterns. Out of that repetition grew a problem. A single soldier might receive morphine in a field dressing station, then again on the wagon or rail journey, again before an amputation in an operating amphitheater, and again on the ward at night to sleep. The hypodermic syringe made such repetition almost effortless. A small, exact dose could deliver near instant quiet. Grateful, bewildered soldiers came to depend on the economy of comfort the needle offered. The sedation after a shot of morphine had social as well as clinical value. It reduced fear and chaos, made surgeries and dressings possible, reassured distant families through letters and reports, and allowed the government to return a larger fraction of its wounded assets to some form of function. Surgeons could work with less resistance. Patients could endure. For a time, that was the highest visible good. The raw numbers, the counts of wounded, amputations, hospital beds, mark the place where individual clinical practice turns into social history. By the end of the Civil War, repeated medically sanctioned morphine exposure was no longer an unusual anecdote. It was built into the structure of care. Army reports and the writings of medical officers like John Shaw Billings, who compiled the medical statistics of the war, describe a system in which narcotics were in continuous routine use. Surgeons such as Frank Hastings Hamilton and civilian doctors caring for veterans afterward wrote about how common morphine had become. The drug did what it was supposed to do in the short term. In the process, it pulled thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, into a long-term pharmacological relationship with opiates that they had not chosen in any meaningful sense. It's important to peel away crude moral judgment here. Many men who became dependent did not choose vice in the way moralists of the era liked to imagine. They walked through a door modern medicine had opened for them, and then war, severe injury, and repeated surgery kept that door from closing. Public debate rarely allowed for that nuance. When veterans returned with shaking hands, relentless cravings for their nightly injection, and lives reorganized around avoiding withdrawal, newspapers and medical commentators coined a new label: soldier's disease. The phrase itself matters less than what it signified, a dawning realization that exposure to morphine in medical settings was strongly linked to later addiction. It was not a term of pure compassion. It carried unease and moral judgment. Physicians like S. Weir Mitchell in Philadelphia described cases of what he called morphinism, laying out the clinical sequence, initial therapeutic use, rising tolerance, and the desperate state of a man when the drug was withheld. Mitchell, who treated nerve injuries and later wrote influential work on the nervous system, voiced a clinical empathy that framed addiction as a pathological result of treatment rather than a simple moral collapse. Others disagreed. Newspapers leaned into melodrama, printing stories of shattered veterans, turning them into warnings about moral decay in the post-war era. Temperance advocates and charitable reformers folded these tales into broader campaigns for societal moral cleanup. Some doctors pushed for institutional cures. Others opted for palliative maintenance, quietly keeping patients supplied. Where the medical profession's thinking was inching, law and policy lagged. Morphine remained legal in most places, sold by apothecaries and often dispensed casually. The 1860s and 1870s were not yet an age of sweeping narcotics laws. They were a time of case write-ups and professional argument. Some hospitals experimented with tapering slowly stepping doses down in the hope of weaning patients off. Others abandoned the illusion of cure and simply rotated morphine with other sedatives at the doctor's discretion. A few adventurous practitioners tried hypnotism and other fashionable techniques to dull cravings during withdrawal. None of these approaches offered a steady or humane way out for many dependent veterans. Social institutions, pension boards, charitable homes, asylums found themselves under pressure to respond. The state's stance was conflicted. The same institutions that had ordered and carried out wartime treatment now had to decide whether a dependence acquired in service counted as a disability worthy of support or as a character flaw undeserving of aid. The stigma attached to soldiers' disease cut both ways. On one side, there was grudging sympathy. The addict had served, had been wounded, had been medicated by the state, now scandalized by his dependence. On the other, there was a punitive moralism, the conviction that character should be rebuilt through discipline. For veterans applying for pensions or work, the label could be devastating. Employers doubted the reliability of men returning from the lines. Families, where they could, hid what they could not heal. Women dependent on opiates, often started on laudanum for childbirth or chronic ailments, faced a different but equally harsh judgment. Their use was read through gendered stereotypes that shaped who received help and who received blame. Institutional responses multiplied in the decades after the war. Hospitals and private retreats opened cure clinics or offered stretches of forced abstinence. Religious organizations ran homes where prayer, exhortation, and rest were combined with gentler therapies. By the 1870s and 1880s, an outright market for addiction cures had emerged. Some treatments were sincere and compassionate. Others were more showmanship than science. Dr. Leslie Keely's later double chloride of gold cure, promoted as a way out of both alcoholism and morphine habit, is a good example of this post-war environment where science, salesmanship, and public desperation tangled together. In hindsight, Keely's clinics are easy to dismiss as quackery, but they also testify to how large the unmet need was. Official medical and government institutions simply weren't ready to provide what people in trouble were seeking. Within professional circles, the way addiction was talked about gradually evolved. Instead of being framed entirely as sin, it started to be described in the language of physiology. 19th-century neurologists and psychiatrists wrote up addiction as disease, tolerance, withdrawal, altered temperament. The shift was incomplete and contested, differing on each side of the Atlantic. In Britain, debates carried an imperial overlay how to manage opiate use in India and among colonial troops. In the US, the conversations were interwoven with veteran politics and an emerging public health consciousness. Old-style moral condemnations didn't vanish, but in at least some medical arenas, they softened into a therapeutic impulse, a desire to treat those whose nervous systems had been rewritten by powerful drugs. Those rewritings had concrete consequences. Doctors, more aware of the risks embedded in their own treatments, began preaching restraint. Surgical practice changed as well. On one side, effective measured pain control made many operations more humane. On the other, widespread use of opioids forced the profession to face long-term sequelae of that mercy. Hospitals' places of cure, but also of chronicity, accumulated growing records of dependence. By century's end, those records would feed into more organized public health and regulatory responses. Those responses, when they finally came, were late, patchy, and steeped in the moral language of the time. The story of morphine's rise and of soldiers' disease is ultimately a medical parable about the hidden price of effectiveness. The small, precise hypodermic syringe delivered on its promise that unbearable pain could be tamed. It often did so in the gentlest, most humane way available. But in keeping that promise, it also created new forms of vulnerability, especially on the vast and brutal stage of 19th century warfare. The soldiers who first felt its relief weren't seekers of intoxication. They were recipients of a modern medical good, deployed at scale. When dependence followed, societies had to ask whether the same state that had relieved pain owed a duty to relieve the new suffering it had unintentionally helped cause. History has a darkly comic way of insisting that our best tools of care generate problems only later reforms can address. The hypodermic made pain a technical challenge and solved it with striking efficiency. War then multiplied the use of that solution until its side effects could no longer be tucked into the margins of case reports. Soldiers' disease became shorthand for a nation's uneasy recognition that instruments of salvation can also fasten new kinds of chains. In the quiet moment after that recognition, both medicine and society began, hesitantly, to assemble responses. Treatment schemes, pension debates, early regulations. Over the longer sweep of medical history, these would reshape how drugs are prescribed and how we view those who come to rely on them. This isn't a tale with one clear villain. It's a story of entanglement: syringe, surgeon, soldier, and state, all knotted together in a new chemistry of care that taught everyone involved painful lessons about relief, responsibility, and the fragile arithmetic of human suffering. In the intimate little theatre of the synapse, morphine behaves like a soft-spoken tyrant, small, precise, and very persuasive. At the molecular scale, nothing here is metaphor. It's all circuitry and chemistry. Morphine binds most strongly to the mu-opioid receptor, the MORAG protein-coupled receptor encoded by the OPRM1 gene. Once morphine settles into that receptor's pocket, it turns down the gain on pain pathways and dims alarm systems. When MOR is occupied, GIO proteins become active. Adenylyl cyclase is inhibited, and inside the neuron, cyclic AMP levels fall. At the same time, GVG subunits encourage inwardly rectifying potassium channels to open and help close N-type voltage-gated calcium channels. The end result is electrical quiet. Less substance P and glutamate are released from presynaptic terminals, and postsynaptic neurons become harder to excite. In the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, where primary pain fibers meet second-order neurons, this dampens the relay of acute noxious signals heading up the spinothalamic tract. In the periaqueductal gray and the rostral ventromedial medulla, similar receptor-mediated effects activate descending inhibitory pathways that further block pain transmission in the spinal cord. Morphine thus attacks pain at multiple layers, working both at the gate and on the messengers carrying the signal, reshaping what the brain receives as suffering. But morphine does more than edit pain. Mu-opioid receptors are scattered through limbic structures and brainstem nuclei, and morphine's presence there alters mood and motivation. In the ventral tegmental area, morphine suppresses GABAergic interneurons. Those interneurons are the brakes on dopamine neurons, projecting to the nucleus accumbens. Remove some braking, and those dopamine neurons fire more. Dopamine levels rise in the nucleus accumbens. The brain's reward signaling swells. A wave of comfort or even radiance can wash over a frightened or exhausted person. That's why morphine doesn't just blunt pain, it blunts the fear wrapped around the pain. It rewrites an immediate narrative of suffering into something duller, sometimes almost glowing. The same molecule also pushes against the brainstem centers that control breathing. In the pre-Butzinger complex and related respiratory rhythm generators, morphine makes neurons less responsive to carbon dioxide and low oxygen. The automatic drive to breathe slows. Give too much morphine and a person's breathing becomes shallow. The body may ignore rising carbon dioxide. Without intervention, this can slide into hypoventilation and ultimately, death from respiratory arrest. That is the clinical endpoint of morphine's pharmacology when pushed too far. Morphine also acts on the second brain in the gut. Mu receptors in the enteric nervous system dampen peristaltic waves, tighten sphincters, and reduce secretions. Clinically, that adds up almost inevitably to constipation. So reliable that older clinicians jokingly labeled it the morning after effect. Pupils constrict meiosis because parasympathetic tone in the iris becomes more apparent when other influences are suppressed. Other autonomic threads are tugged as well. Nausea via stimulation of the area, post-REMA, histamine release leading to itching and vasodilation. Longer-term endocrine effects that can dampen sex hormones and disrupt menstrual cycles. Pharmacokinetics add another layer of rules. Intravenous morphine hits the brain in minutes. Subcutaneous or intramuscular injections are slower but still relatively rapid. Taken by mouth, morphine is much less efficient initially because the liver removes a large fraction during first-pass metabolism. The liver doesn't simply destroy it, it transforms it. Morphine is primarily conjugated via UGT2B7 into morphine 3 glucuronide M3G and morphine 6 glucuronide M6G. M6G retains, and in some contexts even exceeds, morphine's analgesic potency. M3G has little analgesic effect and at higher levels can provoke agitation or neuroexcitation. Both metabolites are eliminated by the kidneys. When kidney function is impaired, M6G can build up, shifting the balance toward prolonged sedation and greater risk of respiratory depression. In most adults, morphine's plasma half-life is only a few hours. Its pharmacodynamic footprint lasts longer because repeated receptor occupation starts to change the system itself. That slow remodeling is the pivot point of dependence. With ongoing exposure, mu-opioid receptors and their downstream signaling machinery adapt. G-protein-coupled receptor kinases phosphorylate the receptor. V-arrestins are recruited. Receptors are internalized or downregulated. Downstream adenylyl cyclase and other components of the signaling cascade can be upregulated as the cell pushes back toward a new equilibrium. Clinically, this shows up as tolerance. Doses that once offered full relief become less effective. Patients or non-medical users need more to achieve the same analgesic or euphoric result. Tolerance develops through multiple layers: at the receptor, in downstream signaling, and behaviorally. Contextual cues, places, routines, the presence of the syringe itself can condition the body's anticipatory responses, also shaping how tolerant someone appears. Many opioids share these pathways, so cross-tolerance is common. A person tolerant to morphine will usually be partially tolerant to heroin, oxycodone, and similar drugs. That allows doctors to substitute one opioid for another in a planned way, but it also means switching drugs rarely produces a clean slate. There's a darker form of plasticity as well. With chronic opioid exposure, some people become more sensitive to pain, not less, a phenomenon known as opioid-induced hyperalgesia. NMDA receptor activity, microglial activation, and maladaptive synaptic changes may all contribute. Paradoxically, raising the opioid dose can sometimes intensify pain perceptions instead of calming them. At the bedside, that produces a grim dilemma: increase medication and risk both respiratory depression and heightened pain sensitivity, or cut back and leave the person in obvious distress. Physical dependence is the predictable biological counterpart to chronic use. It is not the same as addiction, though those two ideas are often blurred together. Dependence means that the body has incorporated the drug into its everyday balance. Remove it abruptly, and the system rebounds violently in the other direction. Morphine withdrawal is dramatic and recognizably patterned. The locus coeruleus A major noradrenergic hub begins firing excessively, unleashing a storm of sympathetic activity: racing heart, sweating, gooseflesh. People in withdrawal complain of deep bone and muscle aches, waves of yawning, cramping abdominal pain and diarrhea as the gut wakes up, runny nose and tearing eyes, restless insomnia, and an emotional vacuum full of anxiety, dysphoria, and craving. For short-acting morphine, withdrawal can begin within 6 to 12 hours of the last dose, peaking over the next day or two, then slowly easing over about a week. Long-acting formulations push the onset later and stretch the course over many days. Biochemically, withdrawal is the mirror image of tolerance. Where MOR signaling had been dampened by chronic drug presence, sudden absence exposes the upregulated adenylyl cyclase and heightened noradrenergic tone. Clinicians use clonidine or related agents to blunt the noradrenergic surge, and methadone or buprenorphine to replace or stabilize opioid signaling more gradually. That way, the nervous system can re-equilibrate without the trauma of abrupt cessation. Naloxone and naltrexone opioid antagonists can strip morphine off receptors immediately and precipitate withdrawal in someone who is dependent. That rapid, forced withdrawal is often intense and, in some cases, risky. Why does dependence develop even when morphine is used exactly as prescribed? Because the brain and body are designed to maintain homeostasis, and ongoing pain itself is often chronic. Conditions like cancer, severe arthritis, or neuropathic syndromes require sustained relief. Morphine is powerful partly because it addresses both the sensory component of pain and its emotional burden. Over time, the nervous system adjusts to its presence. Even meticulously supervised, medically appropriate therapy will usually lead to some level of dependence if it goes on long enough. The degree of vulnerability differs among individuals due to genetics, coexisting mental health conditions, prior substance use, age, organ function, and social environment, but no one is completely exempt. Route of administration makes a major difference. The faster a drug hits the brain, the more it reinforces behavior. Intravenous or smoked opioids create sharp, steep reward signals and stronger learning. That pattern is more strongly associated with compulsive use than slow oral dosing. Likewise, if morphine is soothing not just physical injury, but psychic wounds, trauma, loneliness, despair, the subjective relief is deeper and more reinforcing. The pull to repeat that experience grows, so the clinician's role is both technical and human, to monitor dose and route, to watch for tolerance and hyperalgesia, and to pay attention to the life circumstances that may be binding the patient to the drug. While hospitals and labs were learning this biology, the household absorbed a different language for opium. Laudanum was the everyday, domestic face of the drug. It had entered European practice centuries earlier, tinctured opium in alcohol, sometimes flavored with aromatics. By the 17th and 18th centuries, recipes and prescriptions for laudanum circulated widely. Paracelsus had coined terms. Thomas Sydenham in 17th century England popularized opium tinctures for spasms and pain. In 1821, the writer Thomas de Quincey published Confessions of an English Opium Eater, turning laudanum use into a melancholy, decadent literary subject and lending the drug a strange glamour. In everyday life, though, laudanum was practical. Bottles sat on shelves in kitchens and bedrooms. It was the go-to for cough and colic, for teething infants, for menstrual pain, for insomnia, and for vague, nervous states that doctors diagnosed as hysteria or melancholy. It was mixed and measured at home drops in tea, teaspoons of cordial, small glasses of paregoric, a household fixer, and a comfort for the worn out. Patent medicine makers built their fortunes on laudanum's popularity. In Victorian hotels and American parlors, cardboard boxes and glass bottles promised cure-alls. Dalby's carminative, Godfrey's cordial, paregoric, and in the United States, the notorious Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. They were advertised with splashy claims, lithographed cards of calm babies and relieved mothers, and enthusiastic testimonials. When ingredients were listed at all, morphine and opium were buried under vague labels like soothing or nervine. Measuring at home was imprecise. A teaspoon meant different things in different hands. Household spoons were no standard. Alcohol content and opiate strength varied widely from bottle to bottle, and there were no consistent regulatory checks. Many of these products relied as heavily on alcohol as on opium. Sedating a crying baby became the cultural norm in some communities, even if that sedation was pharmacological. The results were as tragic as they were predictable: infant deaths from overdose and long-term dependence in some surviving children. In Britain and the US, midwives, mothers, and apothecaries formed a quasi-informal health system where laudanum was a common currency. Gender profoundly shaped that system. Women were targeted both in advertisements and in prescribing. Victorian medicine cast female frailty and female troubles as broad, profitable categories, and the marketplace answered with tonics, nerve cures, and soothing syrups. Doctors and druggists supplied opiates to ease childbirth, heavy menses, and the relentless mental load of household and family care. In a society that expected women to shoulder emotional and domestic burdens silently, drug-based quieting of distress was almost built into the culture. Working-class women, exhausted by factory shifts, might use laudanum to take the edge off pain and fatigue. Middle-class wives used it for isolation and invisible pressures. When a male writer like De Quincey used laudanum, he could cast it as an intellectual or artistic indulgence. For mothers and servants, it was a work tool, something that got them through. This functional role encouraged chronic self-medication. Many of the conditions opiates were used for colic, nervousness, sleeplessness, came and went, prompting repeated dosing. Habits formed gradually, dependence followed. Consequences were unevenly judged. A gentleman opium user might be pitied or romanticized. A poor or female addict was more likely to be blamed and shunned. the scale of domestic opiate use was substantial. Pharmacies sold tinctures as routine stock. Traveling medicine vendors carried opiate-laced preparations in bulk. With little oversight, potency varied widely, making risk hard to predict. Then, mid-19th century technology altered this domestic epidemic: the hypodermic syringe. As Wood and Pravaz's devices spread and doctors realized how quickly injectable morphine worked, the cultural and medical dynamics of dependence changed. The American Civil War accelerated this pivot. Injected morphine became a staple of battlefield medicine. Soldiers wounded and treated under these conditions were more likely to emerge needing morphine than those who had used only oral opium. Soldier's disease became the loose American term for opioid dependence picked up in the field. It described a cluster of veterans whose bodies and minds had been trained to expect the drug after trauma and surgery. Public worry about easy domestic access to opiates, the danger to children, the quiet damage in households did not lead immediately to sweeping laws. Instead, the response was slow and layered, moving over decades from professional standards to public statutes. During the 19th century, early efforts tried to tidy the situation. Pharmacopoeias like the first US pharmacopoeia in 1820 and evolving British standards sought to define proper doses and purity for officially recognized opiate preparations. Municipal health boards and pharmacists' associations pushed for poison laws requiring certain drugs to be labeled and sometimes restricting their sale. But patent medicine makers exploited legal gaps. Patent usually meant a trademarked name and secret formula, not a rigorously tested product. The trade flourished by hiding its compositions. Meanwhile, import and manufacturing grew in tandem. Opium for Western markets flowed from India, the Ottoman Empire, and other growing centers under complicated imperial and commercial deals. By late century, pharmaceutical companies were not just extracting morphine, but standardizing and packaging it as a distinct retail product. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, pressure on governments mounted from several fronts. Missionaries and reformers condemned opium smoking in Asia and raised alarms about drug use back home. Temperance activists lumped alcohol and narcotics together as twin plagues. Physicians and public health officials documented infant deaths and chronic dependency tied to over-the-counter remedies. On the international stage, the 1909 International Opium Commission in Shanghai brought diplomats and reformers together to discuss global control. That meeting paved the way for the 1912 International Opium Convention at The Hague, the first major attempt to regulate the worldwide opium trade by treaty. Motivations were mixed. There was humanitarian concern about addiction, national anxiety over social order and workforce reliability, and imperial self-interest. Since colonial governments often depended on opium revenue, even as they were pressured to curtail its use. In the US, two landmark federal laws translated these impulses into domestic policy. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, a progressive-era measure, required honest labeling on foods and patent medicines that crossed state lines and outlawed the sale of adulterated or misbranded products. For the first time, drugs like morphine and cocaine had to be listed on labels if present above small amounts. This was a public health law disguised as consumer protection. It didn't ban opiates, it forced transparency and hit the patent medicine business hard by making secrecy harder to maintain. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 went further. It required doctors, pharmacists, and importers handling opium or coca derivatives to register with the Treasury, keep records, and pay taxes on those transactions. Formally, it was a tax law. In practice, it gave prosecutors and regulators powerful tools. If a physician was seen as prescribing morphine primarily to maintain an addict, rather than to treat a legitimate illness, the Treasury or, later, law enforcement could treat that as a violation and bring charges. Interpretations of the Harrison Act quickly narrowed what counted as legitimate medical use. Many doctors became wary of prescribing maintenance doses to dependent patients for fear of legal trouble. The forces behind these statutes were complex: public health concerns and moral reform campaigns. Yes, but also racial and political undercurrents. In the US, hostility toward Chinese immigrants had long been tangled up with fears around opium smoking. In the post-Civil War period, Racial anxieties and desires for social control colored drug policy discussions. International obligations, like those stemming from Shanghai and The Hague, also pushed national laws toward stricter control. Professional groups, such as the American Medical Association, often supported efforts to crack down on charlatans and standardize legitimate practice, but resisted constraints that treated clinical judgment as criminal conduct. Enforcement mixed bureaucracy and force. Records were checked, licenses rescinded, raids carried out. Federal agents pursued wholesalers and small-scale dealers. In courtrooms, people with addictions and low-level sellers faced fines and jail. A paradox formed, where an addicted person could once buy a tincture at the pharmacy or see a sympathetic doctor for morphine. The new regime made these paths risky or unavailable. Many doctors simply stopped treating addicted patients. Medical and household supplies dried up. Illicit markets took their place. Smuggled or clandestinely refined morphine and heroin circulated in growing urban networks, often adulterated and more dangerous. Punitive enforcement sometimes generated further harm. Pharmaceutical decisions added another twist. Bayer introduced diacetyl morphine heroin in 1898 as a cough treatment, marketing it as a cleaner, less addictive alternative to morphine. It was prescribed for everything from bronchitis to morphine dependence itself. The chemistry did not care about the brochure. Heroin's fat solubility made it cross into the brain quickly and intensely, which in practice made it highly reinforcing. International pressure and accumulating evidence of harm eventually brought it under tight control, but only after years of widespread medical use. By the 1920s and 1930s, prohibitions on manufacture and distribution had created robust black markets in many cities. Policing practices were uneven and racialized. Some communities bore most of the punishment, while others quietly continued to access drugs. Globally, control structures layered up. The 1912 Convention was followed by further League of Nations efforts, and later a succession of United Nations treaties, culminating in the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and subsequent agreements, all trying to balance medical need against the risk of abuse. Yet control often produced unexpected distortions. Tight rules in one region drove over-prescribing or smuggling elsewhere. Fear of diversion led to undertreatment of pain in many low-resource countries. The broad pattern repeats: discovery and adoption, household saturation and normalization, deeper scientific understanding of mechanism and harm, then belated regulatory attempts to contain damage. The story isn't only legal or biochemical, it is logistical and social. Prescribing habits are shaped by packaging, advertising, drug compendia, and cultural expectations about who is allowed to complain of pain. Ships and railroads once moved opium barrels from colonial plantations to imperial capitals. Labs in Darmstadt, Basel, and New York industrialized alkaloid extraction. Patent medicine distributors carried drug-laced bottles into parlors and nurseries. The needle and the kitchen spoon produced different epidemics. The syringe in field hospitals led to soldiers' disease. The parlor spoon and soothing syrup led to quiet household dependence. One law, the Pure Food and Drug Act, demanded better labels. Another, the Harrison Act, demanded registration and enabled criminal penalties. One assumed informed consumers, the other assumed taxable commerce and the need for enforcement. Both changed how easily people could get opiates. There are plenty of ironies for anyone telling this history aloud. The molecule that reliably calmed excruciating pain became, by the same chemistry, the source of new excruciating problems. The remedy sold to save infants and mothers from misery locked some of them into chronic dependence. Laws written to protect society sometimes pushed the most vulnerable into more dangerous, unregulated markets. History almost never offers a single clean lesson. It looks more like a palimpsest layer after layer of good intentions, fear, profit, and insufficient compassion written over one another. Still, the science is clear enough to guide a humane approach. Morphine eases pain by altering the brain's baseline chemistry. It can be used safely with respect and caution, but its capacity to reshape bodies and behavior must always be kept in view. The 19th and early 20th centuries showed just how delicately biology, commerce, and law interact. and how failure in any one of these domains can radiate outward. Look closely and you see very literal hinges in this story. The mu-opioid receptor is a literal protein gateway in a cell membrane. The syringe is literal glass and metal in a hand. The patent medicine trade card is literal ink in a living room. The statute is literal text, drafted and signed. Each hinge swung the story in a new direction. Morphine moved from the opium poppy in a field to a village bottle, to an army tent, to a chemist's vial, to debate in international conference rooms. At each step, societies adjusted, sometimes thoughtfully, often reactively, with a mix of mercy and punishment. In the next phase of the tale, this pattern will repeat again around heroin, methadone, fentanyl, and the modern opioid era. In a modest, gaslit laboratory in Elberfeld at the turn of the 20th century, glassware clinking, flames whispering, and the faint sweet smell of acetic anhydride hanging in the air like a promise chemists at Bayer coaxed a new form out of an old molecule. Morphine had long been dependable, the blunt instrument that quieted wounds and steadied nerves, but doctors worried about how often patients clung to it. So Felix Hoffmann, the same practical chemist, later celebrated for refining aspirin, and Heinrich Dreser, Bayer's ambitious pharmacologist, modified the morphine structure, acetylating it to create diacetyl morphine. Bayer trademarked it in 1898 as heroin, a name meant to evoke heroic strength and bold relief. It was advertised as a gentler, safer alternative to morphine, a cough medicine that would quiet lungs without chaining the will. Articles in medical trade journals and company pamphlets echoed the claim: fewer side effects, less habit-forming, useful even in treating morphine dependence itself. Free samples went out to physicians across Europe and North America. For a brief moment, the medical world accepted the sales pitch. It would make a pleasing story if the compound cared about marketing slogans, if it listened to the hopes attached to its name. It did not. The same acetyl groups that made diacetyl morphine more fat-soluble and thus faster across the blood-brain barrier made its effect sharper, more intense, and for many more compelling than morphine's. Far from being non-addictive, it often proved more gripping. Even the synthesis wasn't truly new. As early as 1874, a British chemist, C.R. Alder Wright, at St. Mary's Hospital in London, had experimented with acetylating morphine and briefly noted the resulting compound. What Hoffmann and Dreser did, with German industrial focus at the dawn of modern pharmaceuticals, was take that lab curiosity, brand it, and distribute it widely to sanatoria, general practices, and even pediatric cabinets for stubborn coughs. Whenever a drug acts quickly and pleasantly, patients will tend to ask for it again. That's how brains work and how businesses recognize opportunity. When physicians realized that this safer morphine substitute was producing its own trail of dependence, reaction came through bureaucratic channels and public alarm. A product once sold as a solution to morphine's troubles was rapidly rebranded as a social threat. Within a couple of decades, mounting medical concern and political pressure had driven heroin into the realm of tight legal control, and eventually outright prohibition for general medical use in many countries. The pattern is familiar. A company promises a pharmacological fix for the side effects of an older remedy. Doctors hope for it. Society absorbs it. Harms emerge. Regulators move later, often sharply. Medicine advances, public policy trails behind, and innovation keeps going regardless. From that point on, the 20th century became a long experiment in fine-tuning the opioid molecule. Chemists set out to keep morphine's power while trimming its liabilities. No longer limited to what the poppy offered, they took other opium alkaloids like thebaine and codeine and used acetylation, hydrogenation, ring rearrangements, and substitutions to create new analgesics. Germany again became a key crucible. In 1916, researchers modified thebaine into a series of oxy-derivatives that would later surface in medicine cabinets as familiar names. In the 1930s and 1940s, with global politics and war-threatening opium supplies, synthetic opioids built not from the poppy at all, but assembled in the lab moved to center stage. At IG Farben, a powerful and later deeply notorious industrial conglomerate, chemists Max Burkmühl and Gustav Erhard synthesized methadone in 1937. Structurally, methadone looked nothing like morphine. but it acted on the same receptor system and, when taken orally, had a long half-life. That made it attractive as a steady pain reliever and, later, as a maintenance drug for opioid dependence. Methadone's story captures the dual nature of pharmaceutical innovation. In the lab, it was a triumph, a potent analgesic that didn't depend on poppy harvests, handy in wartime. In clinical and social practice, it became both a tool for care and a new source of complexity. By the 1960s, in New York, Vincent Dole and Marie Niswander showed that regular, appropriate doses of methadone could greatly reduce cravings and stabilize people addicted to heroin, allowing many to work, parent, and live more stable lives. Their work helped reframe addiction from a moral failure to a chronic, treatable condition. But methadone itself required careful management. Its long half-life and interactions with other drugs made dosing tricky, and diversion and misuse were real risks. The drug that was meant to solve one set of problems created its own need for oversight, guidelines, and treatment structures. Other labs pursued different synthetic paths. Meperidine, Demerol, or Pethidine emerged mid-century as an opioid-like analgesic with a distinct chemical scaffold and subjective feel. It saw wide use, but its neurotoxic metabolite, normeperidine, limited long-term application. In the 1960s, Belgian pharmacologist Paul Janssen introduced fentanyl, a synthetic opioid designed with remarkable potency, roughly 100 times that of morphine. Its high lipid solubility meant extremely rapid onset, making it ideal for anesthesia and for tightly controlled, short-duration pain relief. From fentanyl came a family of related compounds, alfentanil, sufentanil, remifentanil tailored for specific surgical scenarios. Anesthesiologists could now pick among opioids almost the way a mechanic chooses tools, by onset speed, duration, potency, and elimination route. In the operating room, these drugs were nearly perfect. Outside the OR, their strength and ease of synthesis made them prime candidates for illicit manufacture and misuse. Again, the pattern asserts itself. The pharmaceutical goal, better, faster, cleaner analgesia, produces molecules with new profiles, which include new avenues for harm. Heroin reached the brain faster than morphine and captured users' attention more fiercely. Methadone smoothed withdrawal but required regulatory structures and careful oversight. Fentanyl transformed surgery, but once it escaped into illicit markets, drove lethal overdoses through its sheer potency. As each generation of opioids appeared, national laws and international schedules scrambled to keep up. Regulators could list and control known substances, but chemists could shift a few atoms to create designer analogues that slipped past existing statutes. A continuous cat and mouse game developed between clandestine chemistry and legal definitions. Meanwhile, in mainstream medicine, morphine, the old standby, kept its place, though in evolving roles and rituals. In the latter half of the 20th century, anesthesia broadened into a sophisticated blend of inhaled agents, intravenous sedatives, muscle relaxants, and multiple analgesics. Yet morphine remained central for post-operative pain, trauma care, and especially palliative care. In 1986, the World Health Organization published its analgesic ladder for cancer pain. 1. Start with non-opioids for mild pain. 2. Move to weak opioids for moderate pain. 3. Use strong opioids, like morphine, for severe or persistent pain. This ladder was as much an ethical statement as a clinical guide. Do not leave people in needless pain. Escalate methodically. Use opioids without undue fear when they are clearly indicated. Hospitals from Boston to Bangalore used that simple structure to train staff and shape protocols. Clinically, morphine administration became more choreographed. In emergency departments, small IV boluses titrated every few minutes allowed rapid but controlled pain relief. On surgical wards, patient-controlled analgesia, PCA pumps, let individuals push a button to receive preset doses with lockout intervals, minimizing both under and over treatment. For long-term cancer pain, slow-release tablets or oral solutions provided steady levels. In palliative care, continuous infusions or frequent subcutaneous doses ensured comfort when oral intake failed. Start low, go slow became something like a mantra, especially in older or frail patients whose drug handling and sensitivity can be unpredictable. Morphine's metabolism drove some of these cautionary practices. Hepatic conversion to M6G and M3G meant that in kidney impairment, active metabolite levels could rise dangerously. In patients with poor renal function, other opioids such as fentanyl or methadone less, dependent on renal clearance of active metabolites, often became safer choices. In acute severe pain, typical IV titration might involve 1 to 2 mg boluses every few minutes, with close monitoring of respiratory rate and level of consciousness. Once a satisfactory level of pain control was achieved, continuous infusions or PCA settings could be calculated to maintain that state without creating high peaks. For chronic non-cancer pain, things were murkier. Some patients with neuropathic or degenerative conditions benefited from opioids, but across many studies, long-term opioid therapy for common chronic musculoskeletal pain showed modest average benefit and significant risks. Tolerance, opioid-induced hyperalgesia, hormonal and immune changes, diversion and addiction. So practice shifted. Non-drug treatments, physical therapy, behavioral approaches, interventional procedures took on a larger role. When opioids were used for chronic pain, many clinicians used formal treatment agreements, frequent follow-ups, urine drug testing, and state prescription monitoring systems to track use and catch signs of misuse early. Palliative care remained the clearest realm where morphine's benefits decisively outweighed risks. In advanced cancer, end-stage organ disease, or severe breathlessness, morphine reduces the sense of air hunger and eases physical and emotional distress. In hospice rooms from Nairobi to New York, the presence of a morphine bottle or syringe is almost a symbol of committed humane care. Yet global access is strikingly unequal. Many low- and middle-income countries, constrained by restrictive laws, lack of training, and fear of diversion, severely limit opioid availability, even for dying patients in extreme pain. The WHO includes morphine on its list of essential medicines precisely because it is cheap, effective, and, when used properly, life-altering in the best sense for people in agony. Efforts continue to loosen overly rigid regulations in some places while preserving safeguards in others. Against this backdrop of careful clinical use, the late 20th century saw a profound shift. Opioids, including morphine's chemical descendants, moved from being mainly acute, hospital-based tools to being widely prescribed in outpatient settings for chronic non-cancer pain. After World War II, physicians and researchers began taking chronic pain more seriously as a distinct condition. Clinicians like John J. Bonica championed multidisciplinary pain clinics and argued that long-lasting pain deserved the same systematic attention as other chronic disease. That humane impulse laid groundwork for expanded opioid prescribing. Late 20th century medical culture increasingly emphasized patient satisfaction and aggressive pain control. Professional organizations urged doctors not to undertreat pain, and pain rating scales became standard. Pain as the fifth vital sign entered charts and accreditation checklists. Evidence supporting long-term opioid use for many chronic conditions was thin. Still, some pain specialists, influenced by small case series and clinical experience, argued that with careful screening and monitoring, chronic opioid therapy could be safe and effective for selected patients. Industry stepped in with tidy narratives. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched a controlled-release oxycodone product, OxyContin, marketing it aggressively. Sales representatives highlighted improved function and minimized addiction risk, sometimes citing a brief 1980 letter in the New England Journal of Medicine, a 5-sentence report about low observed addiction rates in hospitalized patients, as if it were strong, generalizable evidence. The controlled-release formulation was promoted as being less prone to abuse. In practice, users learned to crush or dissolve tablets to override the extended-release mechanism or simply took them in high quantities. As prescriptions rose, so did the number of pills in circulation in home medicine cabinets, on hospital carts, and in communities. Diversion from friends, family, patients themselves, or theft created a secondary market. Some people who had never received a prescription developed opioid use disorder from borrowed or bought pills. Others started legitimately, slid into escalating doses and dependency. Regulatory response trailed the clinical and commercial trends. Prescription monitoring programs, which allow prescribers and pharmacists to see a person's controlled substance history across providers, were created state by state in the US from the 1990s onward, but coverage and enforcement were patchy at first. The push to measure and treat pain aggressively, combined with intense marketing and a culture of quick pharmacologic fixes, produced what historians now describe as the era of prescription opioid abundance, especially in the United States, but echoed in other high-income countries. That abundance had predictable arithmetic: more exposure, more dependence, more diversion, more overdose. Public health analysts later described the crisis that followed as unfolding in 3 overlapping waves. The first wave, beginning in the 1990s and extending into the 2000s, was dominated by prescription opioids, OxyContin, hydrocodone combinations, methadone used as an analgesic rather than as addiction treatment. The second, starting around 2010, saw heroin rise as a key driver of overdoses. Tighter prescribing rules, abuse-deterrent reformulations of some pills, and shutdowns of so-called pill mills reduced easy access to pharmaceuticals. Many people who had developed dependence on prescription opioids turned to heroin, which was cheaper and more readily available on the street. The third wave began in the mid-2010s, driven by illicitly manufactured fentanyl and its analogues compounds, not produced in regulated factories but in clandestine labs, often mixed into heroin, pressed into counterfeit pills, or added to stimulants like cocaine. Because fentanyl is extraordinarily potent at tiny doses, errors in mixing or pill pressing can easily be fatal. The drug's compact potency also makes it profitable and relatively easy to smuggle and distribute. This 3-wave model came into focus most sharply in the US, but parallel patterns appeared elsewhere. In Canada, particularly in British Columbia and Ontario, high opioid prescribing set the stage for a fentanyl-driven overdose crisis. Parts of Australia and some European regions grappled with rising prescription misuse and later synthetic opioids. Within the US, overdose deaths initially concentrated in certain demographics and regions. Appalachia, parts of New England, deindustrialized towns, predominantly white rural and working-class communities, where jobs often involved physical labor and injury, and where prescribing rates were especially high. As illicit fentanyl spread and contaminated urban drug supplies, overdose mortality rose rapidly among Black and Latino communities in many cities, and across broader age and gender groups. This shifting pattern exposed the ways in which race, class, and geography shape both vulnerability and response. Public health and policy responses evolved unevenly. Naloxone, a fast-acting opioid antagonist that can reverse respiratory depression if given in time, moved from being a hospital-only drug to a frontline community tool. Police, firefighters, and bystanders were trained to use it. Many states changed laws to allow pharmacists to dispense naloxone without individual prescriptions. Good Samaritan laws were passed to protect people who called emergency services during an overdose from certain drug-related charges. At the same time, states toughened prescribing regulations. Many required clinicians to check prescription monitoring databases before writing opioid scripts. Some states set default limits on the duration or quantity of new prescriptions for acute pain. The CDC's 2016 guideline for prescribing opioids in chronic pain urged more conservative use, prioritizing non-opioid options, using the lowest effective doses when opioids were needed, and regularly reassessing benefits versus harms. In practice, some institutions and insurers applied these recommendations rigidly, leading to abrupt dose reductions or forced tapers for long-term patients, sometimes causing suffering or driving people toward illicit drugs. Major lawsuits against manufacturers and distributors alleged that companies downplayed addiction risks, overstated benefits, and saturated small towns with far more pills than local populations could reasonably need. Settlements and bankruptcies for firms like Purdue Pharma symbolized a public reckoning, though the practical impact on treatment infrastructure has been slow and uneven. When prescription reforms and reformulations made pharmaceutical opioids harder to misuse, the illicit market flexed to meet demand with heroin and then fentanyl. Supply restriction without adequate treatment and support simply shifted the problem. Illicit fentanyl's arrival changed the lethality of drug use. Small variations in content or user tolerance could mean the difference between euphoria and death. Counterfeit tablets that looked identical to legitimate oxycodone or benzodiazepines often contained no actual prescription drug, just fentanyl or its analogues, sometimes in doses far above what a person was used to. Public health surveillance death certificates, toxicology testing, emergency department data, law enforcement seizures often ran behind the changing street supply. Communities sometimes didn't realize fentanyl had entered their local drug market until after clusters of sudden deaths. Emergency interventions expanded, naloxone distribution programs grew, overdose education, training on rescue breathing, and harm reduction outreach increased. Some cities began exploring or opening supervised consumption sites, where people could use pre-obtained drugs under medical supervision with naloxone and oxygen on hand, reducing deaths and providing a bridge to treatment and services. In parallel, medication-assisted treatment, or more precisely medication for opioid use disorder, gained ground. Methadone maintenance, long shown to reduce illicit use, criminal activity and mortality, remained tightly regulated but started to be framed more firmly as essential treatment rather than as mere substitution. Buprenorphine, approved in the US in 2002 for office-based treatment, allowed trained clinicians to treat opioid use disorder in general medical settings, although early prescribing caps and stigma limited uptake. Extended-release naltrexone, an opioid antagonist, offered another option for some highly motivated individuals after detox. But methadone and buprenorphine amassed the strongest data for retaining people in care and cutting overdose risk. Harm reduction strategies that had once been politically radioactive syringe service programs, supervised consumption, even small pilot programs of pharmaceutical safe supply, where prescribed, regulated opioids replaced toxic street supply, gained gradual footholds in certain countries, backed by data showing reduced infections, overdoses, and criminal harms. Portugal's decriminalization of personal possession in 2001, combined with strong investments in treatment and social support, became a frequently cited model of public health-centered policy. Switzerland's heroin-assisted treatment programs, launched in the 1990s, demonstrated that even long-term injection heroin dependence could be stabilized, crime reduced, and health improved with medically supervised diamorphine prescriptions. Barriers remained stubborn. Methadone clinics often demanded daily attendance, complicating work and family life. Buprenorphine prescribing in some countries required special waivers, training, and patient caps. Supervised consumption sites ran into legal disputes and federal opposition in the US. Syringe programs were constrained by funding limits and local politics. Stigma among clinicians, police, policymakers, and the general public remained perhaps the most powerful invisible barrier. People who used drugs often avoided seeking help or being honest with doctors out of fear of judgment or punishment. The COVID-19 pandemic forced sudden adaptations. To reduce crowding at clinics, regulators in several countries relaxed rules on take-home methadone and allowed buprenorphine initiation via telemedicine. These emergency measures showed that many long-standing restrictions could be loosened without catastrophe, and they provided evidence for advocates calling for permanent reforms. Across all of this, a consistent evidence base emerged. Medication-assisted treatments reduced illicit opioid use and overdose deaths. Naloxone distribution saved lives. Syringe programs cut HIV and hepatitis transmission and built contact points for treatment. Supervised consumption sites prevented deaths on site and increased engagement with services. The core debate shifted from, do these things work, to will we fund and legally permit them at the scale needed? Some political actors clung to a punitive war on drugs mindset, favoring aggressive policing and incarceration, which research shows tends to displace drug use rather than resolving it. Others advocated a public health approach, easy access to medications for opioid use disorder, robust harm reduction services, and social supports like housing and mental health care. Safe supply initiatives, providing pharmaceutical alternatives in place of unpredictable street fentanyl remain controversial, but are being tested in places like British Columbia as pragmatic responses to a poisoned drug supply. The ethical logic is straightforward. If the unregulated market is killing people, providing a regulated alternative can keep them alive long enough for other interventions to matter. Viewed against this backdrop, morphine's long path from ancient poppy fields to battlefield tents to Victorian parlors to ORs to modern addiction clinics reads less like a straightforward tale of a drug and more like a mirror held up to our systems. Morphine has been a genuine miracle in surgery and palliative care, enabling operations once unthinkable and making countless deaths less brutal. Yet the same pharmacology, in different social and economic arrangements, has fed waves of dependence and crisis. The deeper lesson isn't that opioids are inherently good or evil. It's that powerful molecules inevitably reshape societies, and societies must consciously build structures, clinical, legal, and social, to harness benefits while constraining harms. Every time a new opioid or opioid-like analgesic is introduced, we replay some version of this story. Early enthusiasm, wide use, emerging recognition of harm, then attempts at control, often too late and too blunt. The way forward requires better integration of science and policy, training clinicians adequately in both pain and addiction, designing flexible regulations that preserve access for severe pain and for treatment while minimizing promotional excess and unmanaged long-term prescribing, funding harm reduction and treatment instead of leaning primarily on punishment, and reducing stigma so that people can seek help early instead of late. Morphine's history, including the era of soldier's disease, offers a caution. Medical necessities in one epoch can become social wounds in another if we do not adapt. Remembering that history, without caricature and without forgetting the genuine relief these drugs have given, may be one of the most important tools we have for navigating whatever comes next. By the late 20th century, medicine and public health had begun to absorb some weary wisdom from this long arc. One lesson was humility. Any new drug that changes perception or relieves suffering will send out ripples far beyond the clinic, many of them unforeseen. Another was the necessity of systems thinking. Policies that focus only on one lever-cutting supply, say while neglecting treatment, social supports, and harm reduction, tend to move harm around rather than reducing it. A third was about narrative. How a society talks about people who use drugs, whether as criminals, sinners, patients, or neighbors, shapes laws, budgets, and what kinds of care are politically possible. When use is framed mainly as moral failing or criminality, the policy toolkit shrinks to punishment. When it is framed as a health and social issue, the toolkit can include treatment, support, and risk reduction. Looking ahead, the future of pain management and addiction care will be shaped by both technology and ethics. On the scientific side, researchers are probing more subtle ways of interacting with the mu opioid receptor. Instead of simply turning it on or off, they are experimenting with biased agonist compounds engineered to favor some intracellular signaling pathways over others. The hope is to preserve analgesia while dialing down the pathways most associated with respiratory depression, tolerance, and dependence. Oliceridine has been one example of this approach, an early attempt to bias signaling at MOR. It has not solved all the problems it set out to address, but it signals a more nuanced era in receptor pharmacology, beyond simple, stronger versus weaker opioids. Parallel to this, an array of non-opioid pain strategies is advancing. Peripherally acting pain drugs designed to work outside the brain and spinal cord. Carefully studied cannabinoids for certain conditions. Monoclonal antibodies for migraine and other headache disorders. NMDA receptor modulators such as low-dose ketamine for specific refractory pains. Neuromodulation devices, implantable or external stimulators that alter nerve activity without systemic drugs. Precision medicine may also help refine who gets opioids and how. Better classification of pain types, more reliable biomarkers, and pharmacogenomic testing could allow clinicians to identify which patients are likely to respond to an opioid, who is at higher risk of side effects or addiction, and which alternative therapies might be better. Electronic health records linked to prescription monitoring systems can provide decision support flagging dangerous combinations, high cumulative doses, or overlapping prescriptions from multiple prescribers. But no amount of molecular engineering or software will address the social drivers of addiction. unstable housing, untreated mental illness, trauma, poverty, isolation. Policy will remain as crucial as pharmacology. The most humane and realistic future is one that holds two commitments at once. People with serious pain cancer, major trauma, acute post-operative pain, severe dyspnea must have prompt access to effective opioids. Health systems must minimize new iatrogenic dependence and respond quickly and constructively when opioid use disorder appears. Meeting those twin goals requires structural changes. Better training for clinicians in both pain medicine and addiction medicine. Removing unnecessary regulatory barriers to methadone, buprenorphine, and other evidence-based treatments. Ensuring insurers and health systems reimburse non-drug therapies, physical therapy, behavioral approaches, interdisciplinary pain programs, so opioids are not the only affordable option. Providing stable, long-term funding for harm reduction services, not just short-term grants. Collective memory will be part of that work. Morphine's cultural story, the near-miraculous relief, the shadow of soldiers' disease, the waves of prescription and illicit opioid crises, needs to be taught honestly in medical schools, public health curricula, and journalism. That history can support litigation that funds treatment and prevention. It can temper pharmaceutical marketing. It can inform laws that favor durable health infrastructure over dramatic but ineffective crackdowns. Around the world, policy experiments are already testing different balances. Portugal's decriminalization of possession, paired with robust treatment and harm reduction. Canadian safe supply pilots that prescribe regulated opioids to people at highest risk of overdose from street fentanyl. Heroin-assisted treatment programs in parts of Europe. Wider naloxone and buprenorphine access in the US and elsewhere. None of these experiments is neat or risk-free. Each reflects local politics, resources, and values. What joins the more successful efforts is an ethic of inclusion, treating people who use drugs as participants in care rather than as problems to be pushed out of sight. From this perspective, balancing analgesia and safety isn't a one-time engineering puzzle. It's an ongoing task of governance and culture. Systems must be built to detect early warning signs, rising overdoses, sudden appearance of new synthetic analogs, and share that information quickly across health departments, emergency services, clinicians, and communities. Funding must be steady, not crisis-driven. Harm reduction and addiction treatment depend on long-term trust and presence, not one-off interventions. Clinicians need training not only in pharmacology and tapering, but in recognizing the social determinants of health that heighten risk. And societies must work to reduce stigma, which quietly sabotages every stage from honest reporting to help-seeking to political will for humane policy. Beyond all these structures lies a quieter responsibility to remember morphine's contradictions fully, to remember that morphine has spared millions from unbearable pain, that it enabled surgeons, anesthetists, and palliative care teams to do work previous centuries could not imagine, that for families and hospice workers, it has been a tool of mercy at the end of life. And at the same time, to remember that the way we arrange marketing, prescribing, regulation, and social support around such a drug can turn that mercy into a vector of harm. Molecules do what their chemistry dictates. What societies do with them is up to us. Standing in the middle of today's opioid crisis, we see not just a surge of chemistry and commerce, but a living human landscape. Individuals in pain who need relief and connection. Neighborhoods that need services and stability. Clinicians who need sound tools and clear, realistic rules. Policymakers who must choose between easy slogans and hard evidence. New analgesics will keep coming. Some may be more selective, some may be safer. None will be without trade-offs. Grief, relief, and the universal wish to be free from pain will remain. Morphine's long history, from Sumerian clay tablets to Civil War tents, from Victorian laudanum to fentanyl analogs, shows that miracle drugs always illuminate two things at once: human ingenuity and human vulnerability. We can choose to organize health systems and laws so that these powerful tools are used within structures that expect unintended effects, monitor them, and respond with care instead of panic. In the end, this is less a technical problem than a civic one. It calls for people and institutions willing to carry the work forward the way one carries a lantern, steadily, attentively, ready to adjust course as the terrain changes.